he kind of leaned over, and the first time I didn't notice that he had put his hand on something in between the seat and the console. But he leaned over and he said, "Hey man, you want to give me your truck?"
Hey gang, if you're listening to this right now, odds are you watch videos on the main channel and you've seen how important speed and accuracy are in a gunfight. That's why Active Self-Protection recommends the Range Tech Shot Timer. It's the lowest cost shot timer on the market that we're aware of. Bluetooth compatible with any Android or iOS device. Store all your data on the cloud for free. Native integration with Practice Score and a visual light-based go signal. Visit them at rangetechtimer.com. rangetechtimer.com and tell them your friends at the Active Self-Protection Podcast sent you. Alrighty, gang. Welcome back to the Active Self-Protection Podcast. Once again, I am your host, Mike Williver, and I remain your favorite former Fed. With us today, young man who reached out to me. By the way, he just emailed me, Mike at ActiveSelfProtection.com. I read it, and I got back to him, and now he's on the show. Simple as that. His name is Todd Springer. He is married with one 18-month-old beautiful little boy who does well at the dentist, I just learned. He lives in the Republic of Texas, and he is a facility maintenance tech. That is his line of work. And he's also the host of the Texas Concealed Carry podcast. Todd, thanks so much for being on. I appreciate you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on. I was surprised at how quickly you responded to my email, and I was excited about that.
Yeah, I have a ton of support from everyone at Active Self-Protection. Is awesome, and everything I need they give me, but this is pretty much a one-man show in as much as I answer the emails, I book the guests, I do the recording, I edit the recording, I post the recording, so I'm it. So it's a scrappy little operation, but we're growing slowly but surely. Hey, real quick, folks, if you're listening to this, do me a favor. If you're on Apple Podcasts, go over there and leave us a 5-star review and a rating, and tell your friends. If you're on Spotify, leave us whatever Spotify lets you leave. I think it's a 5-star rating. Let people know, spread the word about the podcast. We've grown leaps and bounds, and we're really kicking butt, and I love the fact that you listen every week, so thanks for tuning in. Now, Todd wrote in with a rather interesting story, and again, I'd like to reiterate, I want to tell all the stories. Not every week is going to be a crazy shootout with a guy with a fully automatic rifle. Some weeks it's, hey, what happens if someone at the dog park doesn't control their dog, or what happens if your drunk adult father is assaulting you and your kid inside the car. There's all sorts of possible scenarios. We want to cover as many of them as we possibly can. So before we get to your story, Todd, talk to us about. I know your self-defense journey didn't start with the incident, but it expanded with the incident. So prior to the incident, what was your mindset around self-defense? Did you grow up around guns or in a law enforcement or military family? Talk to us about your attitude prior to the incident happening.
Yeah, so I grew up in a farming family. My grandfather was a World War II vet. So being that I was in a farming family, we were very outdoor oriented. We hunted fish, things like that. So growing up with firearms was nothing new to me. We actually never kept anything locked up in a safe in our household because firearm safety was preached so much, and that we were so avid outdoors on our own that there was no concern of the kids or anything like that having safety concerns. So leading up to that, so while I was experiencing firearms and the outdoor side of it, growing up, I didn't have much of experience with handguns, but I knew coming up, through high school and things like that. And when the CHL became a thing in Texas before it was the LTC.
Now tell folks what those two things mean. They may not know what those two abbreviations mean.
So previously in Texas, the CHL was the concealed handgun license, which you had to have. Mm-hmm. And it was a minimum of a 10-hour course at the time. And then I forgot what year it switched to the LTC, which is the license to carry course. And that reduced it down to a 4-hour class time. And then they just introduced constitutional carry.
Right. Which means you don't need anything from the government to carry a gun, which is how it should be. Moving on.
Correct. So yeah, I knew that when I turned 21, I wanted to get a handgun, and I knew I wanted to get my CHL. Mm-hmm. My grandfather being a vet, he was very adamant about protecting his family. He was very adamant about everybody else knowing how to take care of the family. And so that just kind of rolled over to me as well. And so I had that in my mind. And me being an avid outdoorsman, I thought I knew everything there was to pistol shooting. And compared to my training journey now, I knew nothing.
Right.
As a lot of LTC holders in the state of Texas, I can say this because I fell into that category, that I scored very high on the LTC or the CHL test at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that that was recognition that I knew what I needed to know to handle myself. And that could not be further from the truth.
Yeah, it's not unlike law enforcement. You know, you get a minimum standard you have to pass at the academy and during your qualifications and all that sort of thing. And I think a lot of officers, deputies, agents walk around with this idea that I'm good to go. You know, I know everything I could ever possibly need to know about my firearm, about grappling, about non-deadly or less lethal, whatever. And the fact is, you don't know what you don't know. And I love that you acknowledge the fact that you thought you were at this point of sort of semi-mastery. And now you realize in retrospect, no, you weren't. So it's awesome that you're acknowledging that and hopefully passing that along to some of the newer people. Because I think one of the problems we have in this space, and you can tell me if you agree or not, is the average person doesn't know what they don't know. They go to a gun store, they get kind of snickered at and ridiculed and mocked by the people who've been there a long time because they don't know what they don't know. They don't know what to ask for. They don't know what to do. So I'm hoping we can change some of that. Has that ever been your experience in Texas?
Oh, 100%. 100%. Well, I like to window shop at the gun store. I hate going to the gun store for that matter.
Yeah.
It's something that I really wish a lot of people could get their head around, especially with constitutional carry happening now, which is great, but there's some mindset things that still need to be worked on.
Agree. I quote Chris Rock almost weekly now. Can you go pick up a firearm, get zero training, load it, and carry it? Yes, you can. And that's how it should be. I want to be clear. Me, John, Neil, Steph, everyone at Active Self Protection believes that should be the case. There should be no, other than making sure that you're not a prohibited possessor for a very good reason, that should be the extent of it. Now, should you do that? No, I don't think you should. As Chris Rock said, because you can do it doesn't mean it's to be done. So I would love to see that awareness raised. I'd love to see maybe more volunteer instructors to give at least a basic course that people can get either free or very inexpensively, something like that. Now, you said you got your permit at 21. So how long have you been carrying?
So I've been carrying probably
Ballpark.
It's probably, if off the top of my head, 15 years now.
All right. So now we always ask, John references his box of shame when it comes to stuff he bought when he didn't know anything, like, weird holsters and crappy Uncle Mike sausage sacks instead of, an actual holster. So what was your first gun, and are you still proud of that selection?
I am not.
Okay.
I'm ashamed of that selection.
It's a pretty common answer. So what did you get?
So I did what every other person, every other guy in Texas does. I bought a Springfield and I bought a 45 because they don't make a 46. That was my mentality at the time.
Hey, it's a thing,
Yeah. And then holster wise, I had what was it? I know it was a leather holster. It was for the like the 3 o'clock position.
Mm-hmm.
It was just a leather holster. I forgot. Was it DeSantis? Was that? No, maybe I'm just thinking of the governor.
They make pretty good. Yeah, they make pretty good stuff. DeSantis makes pretty good quality holsters. A lot of their stuff is kind of last generation. It's kind of old school. So we talk about like a pancake holster with 2 slots and a thumb brake kind of deal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Fair enough. That's not terrible. I was having a conversation with somebody earlier talking about the XD. Did your XD have a grip safety?
Yes, it did, and that was part of the reason why I chose that, was because having not defensive training in mind, but just firearm safety at the time, I I wanted something with some sort of external safety, and
Mm-hmm.
that prevented me. I still had some sort of external safety, but I didn't have to fumble with a
Yeah,
thumb safety. So that's kind of what leaned me towards that.
sure. I think most people who look at that gun and don't know what they don't know, they think, "Oh, this is cool." So, if my hand's not gripping it tightly, then I won't shoot myself or anyone else or anything else, which is all well and good, except for, I don't know if you have heard all the podcast episodes. One of our first podcasts, young man came on telling a story about having to fight off an insane machete wielding possessed demon who came into his place of work and buried a machete in his coworker's shoulder. And he ended up wrestling around with this guy, machete in one hand, gun in the other. The guy's trying to take his gun, and he had several opportunities to shoot this guy and probably end it. But because they were so tied up and close together, his wrist was cocked at about 90 degrees. And when his was that far extended, and he tried to pull the trigger, all he got was slack because he couldn't grip that safety and shoot the gun at that angle at the same time. So I'm not mad at you if you're out there with an XD. I'm just saying, think about your options and consider getting something, moving up as soon as you can do it financially, because I think there's a potential safety risk there. So talk to us about qualifying for your first permit in Texas. Do you feel like the training was sufficient? Was it quality training? Is it done by the state? Is it done by a private party? Can you kind of walk us through that?
Yeah. So it's private party pretty much here. And to be a LTC, well, CHL instructor at the time and LTC now, the basic the minimum requirement is to be an NRA pistol instructor.
Okay.
And then you can go to the DPS school. At the time when I took mine, it was taught by a local sheriff's deputy. He did a good job at going through the penal code and talking about use of deadly force and things of that matter, home defense. He did a good job of breaking it down.
Cool.
When it came to the shooting portion here in Texas, it's not actually a shooting class. It's just a state minimum requirement of, hey, we need you to complete these tasks to show us that you can complete these tasks, and we can't show you how to do anything. So the only thing they teach you is on the law side of it, or the penal code side of it.
Interesting. So you're on your own as far as actual shooting goes.
Yes.
I did not know
And
that.
I kind of understand they were trying. I think where they're going for this is we need to be able to, you take this written test, you do the shooting portion to show us that at a minimal level you have competent, safe gun handling,
Right.
and that's that's the lowest bar that we have that we can set.
Understood. Okay, that's fascinating. I'd never heard of anything like that before. So talk to us about the incident at hand. We always talk about, you've heard John talk about the rules of stupid, don't be in stupid places at stupid times with stupid people doing stupid things, et cetera, et cetera. And that's true. But I was talking to another friend of mine who has a concealed carry permit somewhere. And he's like, look, I work these hours. Sometimes I have to stop at the store. Sometimes I have to drop into a convenience store at 1:30 in the morning because I have to get something. Nothing else is open. So it isn't always possible to follow all those rules, as faithfully as you can. But sometimes you just end up in a place you didn't want to be. So talk to us about where you were and what you were doing and why you weren't armed. If I can do a little spoiler alert, he wasn't armed.
So the reason that I wasn't armed at the time when I started carrying, it was, it's like I turned 21, I got my CHL, I knew I wanted to have a defensive handgun, but my problem was I only carried when it was convenient for me.
That's very common. You're not the only one.
It is, and I try to talk to people a lot about that when I have the chance. But I carried when it was convenient for me, and this was also, I was probably 23 at the time, and so I was still in my running around days.
Sure.
So there was there's a place we frequented, and was talking to a friend one evening. We decided that we were going to go out. This place was, every now and then some vehicles could get broke into at this place. So I generally didn't want to keep my firearm in the car for that reason.
So you're probably going to be drinking. And so you
Yes.
didn't want to carry for that reason.
Yes.
And you don't want it in the car so it can get stolen. Those are both very responsible decisions. Anyway, moving on.
Um, so yeah, so I didn't carry it for that reason. So we were in the location that this happened in was about 45 minutes west of Houston, just so y'all have some context.
Hmm.
But on our way there, there was a Love's truck stop that we frequented. You know, we never had any problems there. It was a little small town, little right at an intersection. Um, and so as we were coming through town, my friend decided he wanted to stop, you know, go get a Gatorade or something. And so I pulled in, and as I was pulling in, this is the part where it's a little bit hazy, but I remember that there were several cars in the front, and I saw one open parking spot. There was a white Cadillac to my left, and there's another vehicle to my right of that parking spot, and I
Okay.
didn't think anything of it, and I just pulled right into that spot. So as soon as I got there, my friend asked me, you know, do you want anything? No, I'm fine. So he hopped out of the car. So I'm sitting in the car, or my truck. I was driving a Z71 Chevy, and
Nice.
so I'm sitting there, and I don't have any tint on my windows. So in the white Cadillac next to me, I see one individual in the passenger side out of my peripheral, and he's, you know, I can see him flailing his arms around, making a lot of noise. And in some of these small towns areas, you run across people that are tuned up. They've been out drinking, um, and so I didn't think anything of it. Just tried to ignore him at first. Well, he kept hollering louder and louder and louder. So I was like, okay, I'm just gonna roll the window down, see what this guy wants, and just see if, you know, we can go on about our way. Hopefully, my friend's not going to be too long.
So real quick, let me just interject.
Yes.
So he is seated in the passenger seat of the car next to you,
Yes, he was in the passenger seat.
and you're driving. You're driving the truck, so you're in the driver's seat of your truck.
Yes.
Okay. And what, like, was he looking at you and making all these motions and saying stuff, or how did you get the impression he wanted your attention in particular?
He was directly trying to get my attention.
Okay, no doubt about it. Okay, I got you.
Yeah, no doubt about it. I was just trying to ignore it, hopefully for the time being, but it was taking a little bit longer, and I felt like this needed to be possibly addressed or de escalate type situation. So I rolled down the window and, you know, just nice. I just asked him, I said, hey, man, what's going on? You know, can I help you? The guy that was trying to get my attention, as soon as I asked him that, he just started, you know, hey, man, you want to fight? Like real aggressive, like. And I'm like, okay, these guys have been drinking and they're just looking for trouble. I said, no, man, I don't want to fight. And he's like, you sure? You sure you don't want to fight? Because you're looking at me like you want to fight. I said, no, I don't want to fight, you know, and you could tell it was the baiting, you know, trying to get a reaction out of you.
Sure.
And so I'm like, no, you know, I don't want to fight, man. I don't want any problems with you. I don't even know you. And then I don't know if this was, I guess, because I realized they weren't going to get a reaction out of me. After about the third time he said this, the driver leaned over, and he kind of leaned over, and the first time I didn't notice that he had put his hand on something in between in between the seat and the console.
Mm-hmm.
But he leaned over and he said, hey, man, you want to give me your truck? And at first it didn't register. And it was I'm sorry, what did you say? And I remember repeating myself. I'm like, I'm sorry, what did you say? And at that moment, I noticed that he had his hand on it. And I mean, and y'all understand what it is, or you know that when there's no mistaking of how somebody's like hand is canted, tilted, that it clearly looks like they have it on the grip of a handgun.
Either he has a gun, or he's trying to give you the impression he has a gun. Either way, it's not good.
Right. And so he looked at me again. He said, I said, you have a nice truck. Do you want to give it to me? And it went through my mind that these guys are really going to try to carjack me. And right as I'm thinking that, I noticed that the cab light clicked on in their car. And so I looked, and while this sounds like it's taking forever, this is like in a matter of seconds.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I get that.
I noticed that neither one of those two guys are getting out of the car. So the only thing that registered me that somebody opened the car on the back door on the back side of the car. So I look behind them. There's a third male in the back seat that I didn't see before.
Mm-hmm.
And he was opening his car door and he has stepped out of the car and he was coming to approach my window. And at that point was when I would say I really experienced, like the adrenaline started to kick in. Like, I need to do something. Something needs to happen. This guy's going to get to my driver's side door, and I don't know what's going to happen next.
Sure.
So at this point, I noticed the guy was getting out of the car, coming to approach me. My first immediate thought was, I need to get out. I can't get out of my car. I can't go forward because I'm in the parking lot and the store's in front of me. My only way out is back. And I want to say this is probably where the tunnel vision really kicked in, because I was just so focused on getting out and making sure that there was nobody behind me. I remember that I checked both my mirrors quickly, made sure there was nobody like walking behind me that I was end up running over. And as I was checking my mirrors, I noticed that the gas pumps were directly behind me and that it was lit. It was a lit area and there were people standing over there.
Okay.
So I didn't even wait, try to roll my window up or anything. I just remember throwing my truck in reverse and I just smashed it and squealed tires coming out of there. The guy that was out of the car, he had to push himself up against their car. I remember because my mirror almost caught him as I was ducking out of it. So I punched out of there. I backed up. I got over to a gas pump. And because of the commotion, some people were looking around. And the guy got back into that car. And so I got my phone. I was getting ready to call the cops, but I wanted to make sure that these guys weren't going to try to pursue me in any kind of way.
Okay.
And so I sit there and I waited. They weren't really doing anything. They backed up. I was trying to see the plates, but they were quite at that distance. It was fuzzy. I couldn't quite pick it up.
Sure.
But they backed out. They had the windows down. And from what I could tell, it looked like they were throwing up gang signs. And then they just kind of casually took off out of the parking lot. They didn't try to pursue me. But then I got on the phone, called 911. I told them, hey, I'm fine. This is the situation. These guys pretty sure they just attempted to carjack me. And, this is the make and model. Don't have a license plate, try to give them all that information. And what I found interesting was when I kind of told them what happened and where I was, they were like, yeah, that's kind of been happening frequently around there. Some people have been getting robbed. We'll send a patrol caller out and see if, if we have any luck finding these guys. And so I just found that kind of odd that they weren't patrolling it more frequently, if that's been happening often, but at the same time, I'm not law enforcement.
I can actually address that for you. So most places, most local agencies have something they call it in San Diego when I was there was XP, extra patrol. So if they get a lot of reports that, for example, the traffic division might get reports that people are speeding through a school zone every day at 3 p.m. So, they will set up radar and check that area more often for that sort of thing and try to do some dissuade the public from doing that by setting up, speed checks. Or, for example, if there's been a lot of burglaries at self-storages, they might have a surveillance team set up on it, or they might have extra patrols where a marking it will drive through. The thing about what you're talking about is they can't station a police officer there all day unless they have all the resources in the world, or a sheriff's deputy or whatever the local agency is. But if they get these reports,
right,
or they have a lot of crime, they will definitely check the area more often, but they can't be there all the time. Does that make sense?
And being that it's a small department, I mean, I can understand that, small towns, they, like where we're at now, I think they have 3 officers in the town. That's it.
Well, there's your answer.
Yeah. So, but at the time, that's what I was thinking for sure. But so I sat there, I wait, they left, my friend came out. and, told him everything that happened. And he was, kind of surprised. Um, and then, we kind of went on our way. But afterwards is when the kind of what really sent me down this path, because immediately after that, I started thinking, okay, man, I really wish I had my carry with me today, because what if I got blocked in by another vehicle?
Hmm.
What if I couldn't back out of that spot? Even if I had a gun, I was still outnumbered 3-1. And who's to say that they didn't have weapons themselves, And so it really reinforced that, like what you said, you don't know what you don't know.
Right.
And so that kind of, that sent me spiraling down the defensive journey of where I'm at now.
Well, you say spiraling like it's a bad thing. You mean that in a good way, I hope.
No,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, absolutely. No, diving down the rabbit hole.
Absolutely. A couple questions for you. First of all, did you
Sure.
ever actually see a gun? I'm sure they probably had one, or at least they wanted you to think they did, but did you actually see a gun at any point?
I didn't actually see one.
That's fine. I had an off-duty incident years ago where these young gang members robbed an old guy of a really expensive like racing bike, one of those super, like $20,000 Tour de France style deals. And we're running down the road
Hmm.
being chased by a couple of other adult males who witnessed the robbery. They beat the guy up pretty good. And I start to follow them. I'm in my personal vehicle. I'm on my way to work, but I'm not in uniform. I do have a firearm on me, and I say to the guys chasing him, I said, "Hey, I'm off duty law enforcement. This is before cell phones were common." I go home, call the police, describe me, describe my vehicle, and the last direction you saw us going, please, and tell them that to send help quickly, please. Anyway, so one of the guys breaks off, but the other guy keeps chasing them for some reason. And what the one guy had said was, "Hey, the guy in the green shirt has a gun." I'm like, okay. So we go a few blocks. This guy's still chasing them. They go back into a neighborhood, and I'm still following at a distance, just trying to keep an eye on them for when the march units show up. And the kid who the other civilian indicated had a gun, stops, turns to face the man pursuing them, lifts his shirt, and goes to reach for what appeared to me to be the grip of maybe a snub-nose revolver, or like a Model 65 Smith & Wesson, something like that. Like one of those black Hogue grips with the finger grooves in it. And of course, I can't
Hmm.
let that happen. So I jump out and black hole this kid. And I'm like, get on the ground, get on the ground. And some things happened after that. It won't make it onto the show. And took him into custody. And it turns out he had taken a set of like really thin, like driving gloves, like race driving gloves, the leather ones, and just
Uh-huh.
molded them over time into the shape somehow. I don't know how he did it, to look like the butt of a
Wow.
gun. And he put that in his waistband thinking he could scare people with it. Well, turns out he was right. He did scare people with it. And then he got scared when I got scared. So I guess my question is, having not seen a gun, maybe an observation, having not seen a gun doesn't mean anything. If they're clearly giving you the indication they have a gun, it's fair to assume that they do, and they have ill intent. It sounds like, Stephanie Widener always says, in a situation like this, you have to radically and rapidly accept reality, meaning don't wonder, hey, maybe this isn't what I think it is. Maybe this is, wish it away, or your normalcy bias kicks in. It sounds like you realized what was happening pretty quickly and acted pretty quickly. Is that accurate?
Yeah. I was actually, I was shocked that that was happening, because,
Of
I mean,
course.
you always hear about it, but, same as all everybody, oh, well, that won't happen to me. But yeah, no, I was definitely aware of what was going on, and I wasn't going to wait around to find out whether they were playing games or what was happening.
So the audience, I'm sure, is wondering, were these guys ever caught? Were they ever caught and found to have actually carjacked someone? Or do you know any more about the follow-up on this?
No, I don't think anything ever came about it.
Very interesting. So, as we are wont to do on this show, let's talk about a couple of lessons. So, if you can go back and do something differently, let's ask you this first, Todd. What would you do differently if you could?
Um, I would not focus on parking right up at the store. I part of my part of my situational awareness now, due to a lot of this is anytime I go into the store or whatever, and my wife hates me for this because she gets tired of walking so much.
Right.
But I always park. If it's at night, I always try to park in a lit area, and I always try to park somewhere where I don't have vehicles on either side of mine to make sure that I have room to not only see what's going on, but I can see once I'm approaching.
That's a great lesson, actually. It's funny that the lovely and fetching Mrs. Williver gets mad at me. If I park in a spot in front of the grocery store and there's a spot 2 spaces closer that I didn't somehow see, I'm in trouble because she now has to walk 13 more feet.
Way.
For some reason, that's a big deal. I'll never understand. That's a great lesson. As a law enforcement officer, they teach you, if you're in uniform especially, because you got a target on your back, don't just walk into places. Don't just walk in with your head, in the ground or in your phone or whatever. Have your head up, look around before you get out of your car. Take a second and look around. Couldn't hurt. It takes a second, literally. When you get out of the car on your way to the store, be looking around, looking for any potential problems, and look inside the store to the extent that you can. Because if there is somebody with a gun to the cashier's head, it might not be a good idea to walk in there. Excuse me. It might not be a good idea to walk in there. So that's an excellent lesson, actually. So what else, if you can think of anything else, aside from having your gun with you?
Outside of carrying and just the parking side of it. One thing that's carried over from that is I actually, when I'm on the road and intersection and things like that, when I'm stopped and boxed in, I have a tendency I pay attention to people in the cars that are around me, what's happening, what
Sure.
are they doing? Because this was essentially that situation. We were divided in our own vehicles, and they were still attempting to do something, through that vehicle. And I mean, that's just kind of where I took that, and I've done it to the point to where all the mental reps that it's just second nature for me now, and I do it without realizing I'm doing it.
I love a good mental rep, by the way. Another thing to consider, dear listeners, is when you pull up to a light and there's a line of cars, don't pull directly as close as you can to the car in front of you. Leave a little bit of room. Wiggle room is always a good thing to have. So let me ask you this. Putting yourself back in the driver's seat, and the guy is to your left, correct? The car's to your left?
Mm-hmm.
So this dude's flailing his arms around, making all kinds of noise, trying to get your attention. Could you have just changed spots or backed out and driven around the block? Was that an option in hindsight? Like, act like you don't see him, and, you know what I mean?
I absolutely could have, and honestly, I probably should have. But, at the time and just, what little experience I had, I didn't expect that situation to turn into that.
Sure.
Like I said, I just thought it was some guys that were tuned up and trying to look for trouble, just de-escalate it. And worst case, I'm in my truck. They're not going to, I don't have to really worry about them getting to me. I mean, here we are having this discussion about these guys trying to do that.
Yeah, for sure. You've helped our listeners burst the idea that the bubble of protection you think you have inside your car. I'll get flipped off by a 102-pound 19-year-old female because she thinks, well, I can just do that and nothing will happen. Now, if she's dealing with me, nothing will happen. However, as I like to tell my kids when they were starting driving, you're not safe inside your car at any time. I don't care if you're going freeway speed, if you're parked, you think no one's around, you're never 100% safe. And when you think about flipping that guy off or getting into a road rage with someone for some perceived slight, I know it's tempting. I know that feeling when you're angry or someone's endangered your life with their driving. But just assume that the person that you're about to flip off or check on the road is some dude who came home from work early because he got fired. And when he got home, he found his wife in bed with his best friend. He's just killed those two. And now he's just driving around without really a plan, but a gun next to him. Do you want to be the person to give him the finger? No, you don't. Just swallow your pride and move on. I'm not judging you, by the way, Todd. I want you to know I think you did as well as you could have done, and especially not having a lot of training in self-defense and situational awareness. I think you did your best. I think you did a commendable job because some people would have frozen up in that moment. So let's talk about a gun safe for your vehicle. There are options out there that are very reliable that can be attached to the frame of your vehicle. If you do that sort of thing, so let's say you're on your way to go somewhere where you can't carry or you shouldn't carry, Having that option is really nice because at least on the way there, and if it's not a drinking establishment, on the way back, you can be armed and have that firearm, close by or on your person, preferably. I would caution you, if this is something you're going to do, don't get to the place you're going. And I'm not saying, I'm sure you know this already, Todd, but for our listeners, don't get to the place you're going, get out and publicly unholster and put your gun into a safe. Find a discreet spot. In fact, I always stop a block or two somewhere before I get where I'm going to do this, and then drive around the block a couple times in case someone saw me do what I did, and park my car and feel pretty good about it not getting stolen. However, leaving your car, even in a safe, leaving your gun, even in a safe in a car, is a risk. So that's, viewer discretion is advised. Use your own best judgment. Did this change the way you trained, or it cause you to train more? I think you said that earlier.
Yeah, it does. So, of course, I finally, at the time when this happened, I got my CHL during the time of super subcompacts, and oversized fishing vest was the name of the game for concealed carry.
It's a good look. The guy from The Big Lebowski.
So I didn't have a lot of anyone for mentor. I also didn't have any good sources for training, and at the time I didn't really have the funds for that. So eventually, I finally, one of my friend that actually hosts my podcast with me, we finally just made the commitment. We're like, okay, we're going to get some formal training, and it helped us out tremendously. And from, we just took what we trained in and what we learned and just progressively started going with it. Luckily for me, we have acreage, so I can go out in the back of my house and shoot and train. I'm not restricted by an indoor range or anything like that.
Nice.
So I definitely shoot more than the average bear. I dry fire at a minimum twice a week. Sometimes life gets in the way. We know how that is.
Sure.
And then I usually live fire at a minimum of once a month. And I try to focus on things of, I'm not all about the sub 1 second draw Instagram stuff. I'm about how fast can I efficiently get it out and get shots on target. Mm-hmm. And if that means me having to wait for my opportunity, I consider that as well in my training, that not everything is going to be up front and close, but I focus on draw to first shot, cadence, moving and shooting and moving. And every now and then being that I'm on my own property, I'll get back there with my personal vehicle and I'll do some work from the vehicle as well, as in shooting from the driver's seat or shooting from the through the passenger window.
Nice. That's excellent. I love to hear it. Don't shoot your truck, first of all. It'll happen sometimes.
Yeah.
Be very deliberate if you're doing that. Training in your vehicle is something that a lot of people never do. I think at the very least, you should find a spot where you're out of the way and people can't see you, and either use a training gun or a safe gun and practice things like, can I get my gun out seated in my car with my seatbelt on? Stuff like that you don't think about. I had this conversation with Stephen Gutowski earlier about, appendix carry versus wherever else you might carry, and all the sort of other goofy permutations of gun placement. I'm sure there's something you talk about on your show as well. If you've never practiced these things, you're not going to magically be able to do them in the moment when you're under stress and your heart's racing and your adrenaline's pumping. It's things you have to get in both mental and actual physical reps, whether it's dry fire, drawing from weird positions, drawing from seated in a car, shooting from inside your car out. And these things are not going to come naturally in the heat of the moment. So it's something you have to, as I like to say, you practice it so much you can't possibly get it wrong. It's just second nature, like dipping your gun if someone walks in front of you, or turning your selector switch to safe as soon as you're off the sights. It's just something you have to practice over and over and over again. Now, with hindsight being 2020, assuming you had your firearm with you on your person in your preferred carry position in that moment, not then, but now, knowing what you know now, would you have done anything differently? Would you have even thought about engaging with your firearm, or just get the heck out of there?
I think I would have got the heck out of there, but I think I would have had it at ready.
Fair enough.
I think I would have had it in hand. That was one of the things that kind of When I thought back on it immediately after, is the first thing that came to mind is, man, if I had it on me, there's a chance that if that guy got to my car window, I could have ended up having to shoot somebody
Right.
and actually been in that situation, not thinking that I would ever actually be in that situation.
Right. Yeah, I think that's the right answer. No, there's no 100% right or wrong answers in these situations, but I think in any scenario, this one or any other one, if egress safely, getting the heck out of Dodge is an option and not engaging, is for a private citizen, for a CCW holder, that's always, always, always the best thing to do if it can be done safely and you're not leaving anybody behind in the lurch. Can I assume you and your buddy who was inside the store had to talk about how long it took him to go get a Yoo-hoo and a bag of Cheetos?
We did have a discussion about that.
That's funny. So before we part ways, Todd, I don't want to leave anything out. Is there anything else you wanted to touch upon? I definitely want to plug your podcast again. It is Texas Concealed Carry Podcast. Is that available kind of everywhere like mine is?
Yeah, so it's the Concealed Carry Texas podcast. And I have it we're on Apple and Spotify and Google Podcasts and a couple of the niche podcasting sites.
Sure.
And I have an Instagram page, which is just Concealed Carry Texas, Concealed Carry _ Texas. And that's about it. And we just try to have, my friend Evan and I, Evan, who hosts it with me, we're into the building scene. You know, ultimately we're hobbyists, and we just try to take, the defensive mindset to, the most serious level, and try to have some tough conversations. We try to be real about everything that's going on in the world. And then we also, we've interviewed some interesting people, made some friends, and it's been a fun ride so far.
That's awesome. So it's the Concealed Carry Texas podcast, folks. Go give that a look. And I also want to say something. I love that I don't know what conversations you're having exactly, but difficult conversations, uncomfortable conversations need to be happening all over the country in this community. Whether it's what I was talking about before, where, hey, how about we don't crap all over someone who's walking into a gun store for the first time and treat them like they're an idiot. Number two, if you go and buy a gun and don't get any training and slap it in a Uncle Mike's sausage sack, or God forbid, open carry it without retention, you're doing more harm than good. You need to get some training and get yourself in a place where you're not hoping things work out, where you can be confident that in that moment, God forbid, it happens to you and you're forced to draw a concealed weapon and use it. A, that you're trained enough that you can do that without thinking about it too much. And B, as I always like to say, having had that conversation with yourself and your God about, can I actually do this? Because as we've seen so many times on the main channel, whether it's the regular videos that John does or the badge cam videos, pointing a gun, threatening to shoot someone, kind of usually works. It frequently doesn't. So don't assume that because you pull your pistol out and brandish it and say, get back or I'll shoot you, or whatever you're going to say. Don't assume it's going to work. It doesn't always work. So if you're trained and back that up, that's better. Having had that conversation, can I do this? Can I pull the trigger? Can I take a human life? Or is my gun going to get taken from me and used against me? All that sort of thing. These aren't fun things to think about. And last but not least, and Todd, I think you'll back me up on this. You train a lot. Train on the things that you suck at. Train on the things you don't like doing. So if your offhand shooting is terrible, try to suck less at it. Wouldn't you say, Todd?
Absolutely. One thing that like you talked about offhand shooting or one hand shooting, and y'all probably make this too, but the point I always try to make, is some instructors that I've talked to or been around, or you hear on social media, YouTube, they always talk about, well, if you get injured in this arm, you might need your other hand. And I always try to approach everything is not so much as being in the middle of a gunfight, but just being in amongst, out in everyday world. What if my hand's not, what if my hand's not injured? What if I'm just holding my 17-month-old and something pops off? Sure. And I need to be able to function in that manner? So I try to think of things like that, not necessarily that I'm in the thick of it,
Right. Yeah, that makes great sense. Todd, I want to thank you again. Folks, don't forget, it is the Concealed Carry Texas podcast. Give me your Instagram handle one more time.
It's concealed carry _ Texas.
And you can see him doing all sorts of super fast, high speed stuff for the. No, I'm kidding. He doesn't do that. Todd, man, I really appreciate you reaching out with a story. Like I said, folks, he sent me an email. We talked, and he's on the show just like that. It's not complicated. And if it weren't for people like Todd and others, I wouldn't have a show. There'd be no one to talk to, and no one's going to tune in to listen to me run my mouth for an hour. And if it weren't for you, dear listener, tuning in every week and coming back for more, I wouldn't have this job anymore. So thanks for listening. Don't forget to stay tuned for the Gutowski Files coming up right after this interview. Todd, thanks so much.
Yes, sir. Thank you for having me on.
Okay, gang, that's our interview for this week. Now on to what you all came for. It's time once again for the Gutowski Files featuring Stephen Gutowski. He is the founder of TheReload.com and the host of the Weekly Reload podcast. Stephen, happy holidays, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year to you, sir.
Thank you. How are your holidays shaping up?
Pretty well. Everyone appears to be not sick and mobile and ambulatory and able to go visit one another. So we got family coming into town. Looking forward to that. Trying to find a little tiny Santa hat for Rocco, the Active Self-Protection podcast mascot. So we'll see. Nice. But yeah, things are good. I can't complain.
We got a little bit of a COVID situation with my girlfriend. So hopefully that clears up before we have to go up to Pennsylvania for the holidays. She's doing fine, but the guidelines, the CDC guidelines want you to wait 5 days. So it's cutting it close. We'll see. Hopefully she doesn't have any symptoms a day or two before we got to go.
Yeah. God willing. It's funny you should mention the CDC, Stephen, because this week we are discussing the CDC, who apparently had some, shall we say, off the books meetings with some people and apparently changed some information on their website. Also, if you want more on this, go over to TheReload.com. And I think by the time this comes out, there'll be a podcast. Even talk about that real quick, your podcast, and who your guest is and what you talked about there.
Yeah, this week we actually have somebody who was involved directly in the story on the podcast and have a pretty good, civil but vigorous back and forth about exactly what unfolded and some of the controversy that's come out of this.
So what did happen? Tell our listeners what's going on over there at the CDC.
So the CDC, as people might know, does some work on guns and gun violence and also defensive gun use, or at least it has some resources on these things. And they have a website, the Fast Facts website, that provides some insight into how many defensive gun uses there are per year in the United States, or at least it used to. It gave some insight into what the estimates are out there, because there are a number of estimates and they vary significantly depending on, how a survey is conducted and the questions asked and so forth, as you might expect. But the website didn't initially, it never took a position necessarily on these estimates. It didn't say one was better than another. It gave a range, and it gave a link to a paper the CDC had commissioned that reviewed these different estimates so people could read more information. However, that all changed earlier this year when the CDC removed that link and that language and replaced it with essentially a note that said more research is needed, which the top issue with that people have with that change is the reason why it happened. And that was due to lobbying on behalf of some gun control advocates who had been connected with top CDC officials by the White House and members of Senator Dick Durbin's office. Dick Durbin is a Democrat from Illinois. And, they had a series of conversations, private conversations about why they don't like the higher end of that estimate spectrum, the 2.5 million defensive gun use per year estimate that first came out in the 1990s from Florida State University criminologist Gary Kleck. Mm-hmm. It's probably one of the most well-known estimates out there. Certainly you hear a lot about it on the pro-gun side of the debate for fairly obvious reasons. It shows that there's quite a lot of people who use guns for self-defense each year. And they did not like the survey that was done by CLEC for a number of reasons that stem from critiques that have been around of this kind of defensive gun use estimate for several decades. There really wasn't a lot of new information in it, in these conversations the CDC had with these advocates, but they included a lot of the general critiques that are out there of CLEC's work, and then there, of course, were explicit appeals to the politics of these estimates. Didn't like the impact that CLEC's 2.5 million defensive gun use per year estimate has had on efforts to pass new gun restrictions in the United States. I'll just give you a straight quote from this. Put simply, in the time that study has been published as a, quote, CDC study, gun violence prevention policy has ground to a halt in no small part because of the misinformation that small study provided. So that's a quote from Mark Bryant of the Gun Violence Archive, which people might know them from their mass shooting counter. They're the ones that are often cited by major media whenever you hear, there have been 600 mass shootings per year or something along those lines. That's where that number comes from, is from this person's group. And he was involved in these discussions alongside Devin Hughes, who runs GVpedia, Gun Violencepedia, and Poe Murray, who is a sort of a more traditional gun rights activist, who runs the Newtown Action Alliance and is one of the most bombastic gun control activists in the community. But actually, Bryant is the one who's going to be on the podcast. So we had a whole discussion about this story and also about methodologies and things like that. But the main controversy in this situation was surrounding more the process of the CDC deciding to listen to these advocates in private without any other consultation with outside groups from the gun rights side of the issue or really anyone else besides them, and then changing their website basically in compliance with what these advocates had asked for.
Yeah, I think you and I talked at length for at least probably 45 minutes before we even started here about that aspect of it, about the methodology. How do they come up with these numbers? And there's a lot of factors that I think most people wouldn't consider. We talked about a few of them. One of the things I brought up is, hey, if you're being asked about defensive gun uses and you live in a place where you're kind of forced to carry illegally because there's zero chance of you getting a permit, and you live in a high crime area and you genuinely need a gun for protection, and you have to kind of ride dirty, as it were, to do that. Two things. One, you're not going to answer those questions truthfully, probably, or you're just not going to respond to that survey. And two, if I'm walking on the street in Southeast Washington and somebody comes up with me, looking to rob me, and I brandish a gun and they run away, am I calling the police? If that's no, if that gun's illegal, absolutely not. Besides that, there's a million other reasons why this might get underreported. You talked about, I can't remember who it was, but somebody gathering all the gunshot wound stats from all the hospitals in the United States and saying, okay, that's how many, excluding police shootings or whatever, or homicides, that's how many defensive gun uses there are, which is preposterous on its face.
Yeah. So there's, I think the basic part of this story, what makes it controversial, is pretty simple, which is just the private, hidden nature of this decision-making process by the CDC. Why they decided to remove. I mean, they really ended up removing information for people. It's supposed to be a resource where people can get basic facts and then perhaps read a bit more about them. That's what the initial statement on the website did, right? Is give people a resource they could go to that was commissioned by the CDC that looks at some of these different estimates out there, and it warned them, right, that there are a number of ways to try and calculate this sort of phenomenon of defensive gun use. And so, I think that's the easy to understand part, right? Is like this, well, maybe if they had done this in public and they consulted, different points of view besides just the one side, and there was an intervention from the White House or a Democratic senator's office, it would have been less controversial, right? This has gotten a lot of attention since we broke this story, but unfortunately, that's not how they decided to handle it. The CDC did this in a sort of backrooms fashion, and we only found out about it because a gun rights lawyer, Constantinos Morris, decided to FOIA these documents and look for these communications, and so that's how we know about it. But the base core of the story is pretty easy to understand. The rest of it is certainly interesting to probably to people like you and me, where you get into this debate of, well, how do you best measure defensive gun use?
Which is a great question.
Because certainly, yeah, and it's a very fair question. And I think it's a fair thing for the CDC to say, like, well, it's hard to do, and you're going to have different definition, different outcomes, but depending on how you try and go about doing it. And there's basically, you alluded to this already, but there's two main approaches to this. There's the one approach, which is what the gun control advocates were pushing for, what Bryant was saying to the CDC, which was, you got to find verified examples of defensive gun use and try and count all of them. And so, there's this sort of gun wound analysis that some people have tried to do in the past, which were used to critique Kleck's work. You also have Bryant's own gun violence archive tries to track defensive gun uses, which using media reports and some police reports as well, and those tend to produce very low numbers. So Gun Violence Archive produces something like 2,000 a year, which is obviously extremely, extremely different from 2.5 million.
Slightly, yes.
Right. And the other hand, the Kleck approach are survey-based approach. So you just ask people if they've ever used a gun in self-defense, right? Because then you can capture more of those situations you're talking about where, for instance, one of the most recent surveys, and we had this professor on the podcast a while back as well, William English from Georgetown University. He found that 81.9% of people who reported using a gun in self-defense never actually fired a shot. So they're very unlikely to show up in a media report for certain. And if you look at the Gun Violence archive on defensive gun uses, I think it's something like 4% of the cases don't involve anyone actually being shot, and so or actually firing a shot. So most of their cases that they identify, and there's some critiques. I think John Lott had a piece in Real Clear Politics that said they're undercounting even the sort of verified ones. There's plenty of controversy out there on all sides of this, but they're probably capturing the most high profile examples of defensive gun use. If you're using media reports, that's what you're going to be getting. Right. And you're not getting that situation that you described where either because it's perhaps the person owns the gun illegally or what have you, or maybe they just don't trust the local law enforcement. That's a huge problem in lots of communities in this country, whether it's inner city or rural communities. There's a lot of tension oftentimes between law enforcement and the community, and you might not want to. A lot of people, just put it this way: the first thought of a lot of people who pull a gun on somebody, and then that person, like somebody who's trying to threaten them or break into their house or something, and then that person runs off and nobody gets hurt. The first thought of a lot of people is not going to be, "I'm going to call the police and tell them I pulled a gun on somebody." Right. You know what I mean? Like that's just even if you don't think you've done anything wrong. Even if you haven't objectively done anything wrong, it's not a common scenario where that's going to be the first thought of it in a person's mind. There's sort of a very specific kind of person where that's the first thought, including kind of myself, right? Like a suburbanite person might do that. And I have, and I've been in situations where I know somebody who's used a gun to defend themselves. Someone tried to break into their home through like, the apartment, the door on their apartment, but they never saw the person, and the person ran off after they told them they had a gun. And we called, they called the police in that scenario. But even then, it's like, if you don't have a description of the suspect and you never fired a shot at them, no one got injured, they didn't actually get inside, what would a police report even look like in that scenario?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of places, I was saying this before, I live in Tucson, you call the police and tell them, hey, someone was banging on my door or trying to open my door, and I yelled, I have a gun, and they ran away. They're not coming out for that. There's not going to be a report, or it's not going to be a statistic at all. And as we said,
right,
defensive gun use can be anything from saying to someone who is trying to hurt you or trying to take something from you, I have a gun, to brandishing it, to firing it in the air, or warning shot, which is inadvisable, but that, people do that, to shooting a person and missing, to shooting a person and hitting. And so, I'm not sure this stat can ever be actually, not that this was a point of the story, I know, but I'm not sure that stat can ever be accurately calculated. I don't know how you do it unless everyone takes a truth pill and they all have to tell you exactly what happened.
Yeah, I mean, it's like anything. You're never going to have the God's eye view of exactly what's going on. I think there's strengths and weaknesses to either approach. We just talked about some of the weaknesses of the approach of using media reports or even police reports to try and get at this number. There's obviously weaknesses to the survey-based approach as well. For instance, people will sometimes, they'll tell you, they'll give the response that they think makes them look the best.
Sure.
That's a identified phenomenon with survey results.
Human nature.
So, yeah, I mean, like one of the critiques of Gary Kleck's work was, for instance, he identified 2.5 million. He actually did a couple of different calculations. So it's sort of try to take some of these factors into account and come up with a couple of different estimates. But the most popular and well-known one is the 2.5. But at the same time, he asked people if they had reported the incidents to police, or the police had become aware of them, and there were something like 64% of respondents said yes. And even Kleck himself, in that initial study, warned that, obviously the math there would be, you'd have something like, over 1 million self-defense gun use reports in police possession across the country, if that were the case. And it's probably, I know that there's not evidence that levels are that high.
Right.
And as far as like reported incidents to police, but this is one area where, at least according to Kleck, you could have that sort of effect of like people, if somebody tells you that they've used a gun in self-defense, the sort of morally right response when asked if you reported that you did that is probably going to be yes. And so you might get people over-reporting that. You might get people who want to claim to a pollster that they used a gun in self-defense when they haven't, because that maybe they feel that makes them look good. You'll get people who used a gun in self-defense, but you can get criminal use of firearms in there as well, presumably. People who say that they were using a gun in self-defense and really they were the aggressor, or something along those lines, because it's self-reported. Right. That's the shortcoming of the survey-based results, is you get all these potential. You have, Kleck argues that you also would have an undercounting, because people, for instance, people might just not want to respond to. There's a sort of phenomenon out there of gun owners don't want to respond to pollsters when they ask them about their guns, or if you get asked about shooting somebody or shooting at somebody, you might not want to tell anyone about it, for the same reasons you might not want to call up the police, just that you don't want that extra scrutiny on yourself, even in the situation where you haven't necessarily done anything wrong. So yeah, there's a lot that goes into trying to come up with a good count, and it's not easy. And there are different approaches that will give you vastly different numbers. The lower end that the CDC cited initially comes from the National Criminal Victimization Survey. That's where you get the 60,000 per year number. And you might sort of see one of the weaknesses just from the name of that survey, which is that it is a survey of people who consider themselves to be victims of crime. And so if you have used your gun to stop a crime from occurring against you, you might not consider yourself to be a victim of crime.
Right.
Of course, that survey also has the shortcoming of not explicitly asking people if they used a gun in self-defense. It's more, it's a more general survey. It's trying to get the breadth of how many crimes happen per year, because it's sort of the same issue with crime as you have with defensive gun use, in that very likely not all crimes are actually reported to the police. There's plenty of, for instance, financial crimes. If you get scammed, there's sort of a shame to it, and people don't necessarily report that to the police every time it happens. Or again, you go back to the sort of the community relationship. How good is the relationship between law enforcement agency and a certain community? That can affect whether crimes get reported, so on and so forth. There's a lot of reasons why you might not have every crime get reported to the police. And so they do this survey to try and figure out how well are we capturing crimes in our law enforcement apparatus. And they don't ask you directly if you used a gun to defend yourself. They ask you if you were a victim, and you say yes, then they'll ask you some more questions. One of the questions is whether you did something to try and resist the crime. And if you put down that you used a gun in that question, that's how they get the calculation. So you can see why that would be, even though it's survey based like CLEX numbers, you can see why there'd be a huge gap between those two estimates.
Absolutely.
And there's a lot that goes into that. But I think the problem is when you, instead of adding that kind of context, right?
Yeah,
the CDC just took it away.
Yeah.
Just took everything away.
Yeah, the CDC doesn't need any help with the sort of erosion in the public trust for that particular agency. They've had quite a few years here where there's been a lot of things that were maybe a little questionable. That's my editorial, folks, not Steven's, just for the record. He is a real reporter, and so he has to maintain integrity, unlike me. Folks, listen, Steven and his staff over there are breaking these kinds of stories that no one else is even talking about, never mind going out of their way to bring to your attention. So do me a favor, go over to thereload.com, that's thereload.com, and carefully consider getting a membership. Steven relies on your membership dues to fund his important work. Steven, hope you have a Merry Christmas, and I'll see you next week.
Merry Christmas, absolutely.